Over the last several months, the nation has begun a long overdue conversation about sexual harassment. The way it degrades and demeans people, the way it limits economic opportunity for women, the way it reflects and also worsens power imbalances in the workplace. The Me Too movement has lifted the curtain on the pervasiveness of this crisis, and it has empowered and emboldened ordinary people who will no longer accept an unacceptable status quo. It has given people the courage to speak up and fight back. AFSCME has zero tolerance for sexual harassment, both as a representative of working people and as an employer ourselves. Fighting for fairness, equality, safety, and dignity on the job is part of our DNA. Now we are using this moment to strengthen our work to stop sexual harassment in public service workplaces and to join with unorganized workers in solidarity against harassment and discrimination. We are honored to partner with the AFL-CIO, the National Women's Law Center, and Jobs with Justice in this effort. Thank you for participating in this critical conversation. Now let me turn it over to AFSCME Secretary-Treasurer Elissa McBride.
Thank you, Lee. The Me Too movement has made public what for too long has been an open secret. Harassment affects women of all ages, professions, races, and income levels, and many men as well. Harassment is a systemic issue, and there are real consequences to not addressing it. And harassment is always an issue of power. All of us need to be part of the movement to stop it. We're grateful to everyone who took time to submit questions to the conversation today and to all of you who are joining us online. This is an issue that concerns our whole union and all Americans, so thank you to everyone, sisters and brothers, who is with us today. All workers deserve workplaces that are safe, inclusive, and respectful. And this moment has given us a chance to move that agenda aggressively. So today we hope to provide some practical advice for union members, leaders, and even management in dealing with harassment in the workplace. We'll also talk about how to build on the energy that has begun with the Me Too movement to transform our culture and create harassment-free workplaces for everyone. Now, let me introduce the amazing women who have joined me today for this conversation. Liz Shuler is the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, which represents 12.5 million working Americans. The AFL-CIO created a code of conduct that says it will not tolerate discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior in the workplace or at any of its events or meetings. Fatima Goss Graves is the president of the National Women's Law Center, and the NWLC is a leader in the fight to end harassment. It was chosen to administer the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which was recently launched by women in the entertainment industry to support others who faced harassment in the workplace. And finally, Sarita Gupta is co-founder of Caring Across Generations and the executive director of Jobs with Justice. Jobs with Justice fights for all workers to achieve economic security through collective bargaining and economic justice. And I want to start just by asking each of you to say a few words to really tell us about one thing that your organization is doing to respond to this Me Too moment and move towards our goal of harassment-free workplaces. So why don't we just hear from each of you for a couple of minutes, and we'll start with Liz Shuler from the AFL-CIO.
Great.
Yep.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Elissa, to both, obviously, Lee Saunders as president of AFSCME and yourself for being real leaders on this topic, and by having this event shows real leadership. So I want to say thank you for that. And the AFL-CIO has had, I would say, a moment right along with the Me Too moment, which is that the labor movement has always fought sexual harassment in the workplace, but that we know we can do more. And so we, as was mentioned earlier, have a code of conduct. It may not be the most exciting name for it, but I think it's a groundbreaking policy that we've instituted, which is to set the tone at every event and function that we have in the labor movement that the AFL-CIO is a part of, to really set an expectation of what kind of behavior is we expected and what we won't tolerate. So no harassment, bullying, or discrimination of any kind. And in the policy, it sets out specifically what to do if you encounter that behavior, who to go to, what the process is. And so we've trained and equipped our leaders at every meeting we have to be able to handle that. And it's the first order of business. So I think that's the really big signal, is that we start every meeting by reading the code of conduct before we do anything. So people say, what's going on here? This is different, and they know that it's not tolerated. So in addition, we also did a recent convening, which you were a part of, Elissa, to bring the labor movement together with partners to talk about what could we be doing for women in the world of work, and men too, who are experiencing this. And the labor movement has a powerful role to play. And so that convening on February 6th really did outline some takeaways, concrete things that we can do that'll be coming out in a report in a couple of weeks, but basically highlighting unions and collective bargaining as a real solution.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Fatima, tell us a little bit about what you're up to.
And I have to echo my thanks as well for having this conversation, because I think labor's role right now is so important. So the National Women's Law Center has been around for 45 years and working on issues of harassment and violence and the ways in which institutions can respond to them for nearly that entire period across our education work, our employment work. We also do a range of work to support our lowest income families and work on health and reproductive rights. I name those issues separately, but we know that that's not how women live their lives, and it's deeply integrated. And our work involves a mix of law, policy, and culture change, which when we think about this issue right now and in this moment, how important those mix of strategies really are. And that's what we've been doing. So we have been working to move laws and policies in the states and working with our partners really deeply on that, so that there are real proactive solutions to the problem. We have been working to bring together a range of voices to have these conversations about what it is that we have been doing, but what we can do in this moment. And then really, I'm just really so proud that the National Women's Law Center is housing and administering the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which is really the first fund of its kind. We have, in 2 months, with a series of really dedicated partners in the entertainment industry and beyond, raised $22 million to support the work to connect lawyers with the many people who need these resources. Since January 1st, when we launched this fund, we've heard from over 1,600 people seeking help.
That's great. Thank you. Sarita, tell us about what Jobs with Justice is doing.
Yeah, thank you again for having me, and it's wonderful to share this space with all of you. So I'm going to talk mainly wearing my hat for the moment of Caring Across Generations, which is a campaign that's focused on bringing together care workers, families, aging adults, and people with disabilities to transform the way we care in America and really look at the issue of long-term care. And our focus has been on home care workers. And so from that perspective, we've really entered this moment looking at the experience of care workers, like really centering as an intersectional campaign the experiences of predominantly women in this workforce who have in fact experienced sexual violence and harassment as either domestic workers or care workers that in work that takes place in homes. It's actually quite prevalent and common, more than people think. And you know, the care industry is quite complex. You know, some people are hired by agencies that the work is paid for through Medicaid. Some are hired by families directly. Some are in the private market, hired by people in need themselves directly, or the gray market, some people refer to that. So a lot of our work has been taking the lead of our partner organization in the campaign, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, really looking at some of the most vulnerable care workers who are in that gray market arena. And what we've been doing is actually amplifying their stories. They've been a big part of the Time's Up movement and the work to sort of bring out the powerful stories of these women and their experiences and linking it with other vulnerable women across our economy. We've been educating domestic employers, so working with partners like Hand in Hand, which is a domestic employers association, helping develop a guide for many of us who hire from time to time care workers in our homes to care for our loved ones. How do we make sure that our homes as workplaces are safe and harassment free? And then finally, we've also been advocating for and moving state-level policies, workplace policies, and frankly, campaigns that really address the deep inequities that we find. I mean, you started off, Lisa, talking about power, and how do we address the real issues, especially for women in low-wage sectors of the economy, who are put in really vulnerable positions where they are vulnerable to this kind of harassment. And so we've been doing a lot of support of campaigns that really speak to those sets of workers, whether they're care workers or restaurant workers or others.
You know, just knowing how many members of AFSCME are caregivers, I'm so grateful for that work. And I'll just add on behalf of AFSCME, in terms of what we're doing, we'll be able to talk more about this, but we really want to equip you, AFSCME leaders and stewards and members, with the resources that you need. And we've got that on our website, afscme.org/prevention resources. And there's more information, including some wonderful checklists and guidelines that I know all of you are relying on from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as sample contract language that your sisters and brothers have put into their own collective bargaining agreements to help push management and make sure that anti-harassment policies are in place. So you'll find all of that on your own AFSCME resource page. And I think that's the main thing we're doing, is thinking about how to equip you to be an advocate on this issue in the workplace. So let's turn to our first question. We had a process where people could ask questions of this incredible group of folks on Facebook. And so our first question is a really basic one, but one I'm actually eager to hear clarified for us by Fatima from the National Women's Law Center, which is, what is or is not workplace harassment? So Fatima, why don't you help us with that one?
I'm happy to do that. So, you know, I'll start with the legal definition, but then I really want to talk more broadly, because I think this moment requires us to do so. When we think about harassment, the legal definition looks at conduct that is unwanted, that is severe or pervasive, and that can either rise to a level of an environment that is hostile, or sometimes rise to a level of an environment that someone must leave, right? So there are legal definitions that that flow from there, and it's when it is on the basis of a class that is protected. In this case, we're talking about sexual harassment, but you can have harassment based on race, on age, on disability, or all of those things, right? And I will just say, from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, we're finding people coming in who it is an issue of sex-based harassment, but it is also race-based harassment that they're complaining about, and age and other factors. But employers should be thinking more broadly than, what is the legal definition of harassment? What are my compliance obligations? They should be thinking about, how do I create environments that are inclusive and welcoming, and that allow people to work with dignity? And if you start from that as the perspective, rather than worrying about how many times does someone have to put out a comment that is unwanted, and before it rises to the level of a hostile environment, that's a way to get into trouble. You should start from the perspective of, how do I create conditions where people can work with dignity. So the last thing I'll just say about it, because I do think in this moment that there sometimes has been confusion, that harassment can come in verbal forms, it can look like sexual violence, and everything along that spectrum.
Yeah. Anything anyone wants to add on that? I'll just say that I think we're learning from the data that's being gathered that the vast majority of women have experienced some form whether it's verbal or a more serious
One
form.
in 3 women say they've experienced harassment at work, but I would say if you look at certain sectors, those numbers get to 70%, 80%, 90%. When you poll care workers, when you poll restaurant workers, when you look at women working in construction, those numbers get really sky high. So it is something across industry, but there are some workplaces that have higher rates.
Okay. So I think our next question is one that was video recorded on Facebook, and we'll go to that question next.
Hi, my name is Laura from Duluth, Minnesota, and my question is, what is the role of management in ensuring a harassment-free workplace?
Sarita, why don't you take the lead on this one?
Sure, and actually I would build off of what Fatima just said around having the importance of management, looking much more expansively at this question of how do you create a harassment-free workplace. So I guess the first thing I'd say is to affirm that management's role is in fact to create a harassment-free workplace, a safe, a respectful workplace, an inclusive workplace that has a culture of diversity, equality, and respect. And I think there's a lot that can be done right now that management can be doing. One is just building off of this first question, helping to educate employees about that fine line between what is harassment and often what you hear is like, I was just complimenting somebody, right? And so, there's employee education work that management can do. There's the role that management plays themselves in modeling what is a respectful culture to a zero tolerance culture, but a lot of that has to get modeled at the management level and make sure that it seeps through the whole company or organization, if you will. I think, really ensuring that there are systems in place for when people come forward with, real stories of harassment, that they can do so without reprisal, and that's really important for management to create that culture and the systems in space, and for workers to feel like they can actually do that. And then finally, I would say it's, I think as management in that role, they can never assume it will not happen. I've talked to a lot of employers, particularly, unfortunately, women, who will say, well, I'm the CEO, or I'm the head of this company or this organization. This doesn't happen under me. And so never to assume it won't happen, but to, in fact, be proactive in creating the kind of culture that ensures that this can't happen. So those would be some thoughts, but I'd be curious if others want to add to that.
Well, and I think that I just want to reinforce the idea that management doesn't just have a role. It starts with it starts with leadership,
That's right.
Naming that this is a value for them, putting it in the center of the work that they are doing, and reinforcing that repeatedly.
In fact, it's the law. It is management's responsibility to create a harassment-free workplace, and our role is as advocates, and all of your role as advocates for your coworkers is to encourage, pressure, assist, but the responsibility lies with management. I think it's really important that we're clear about that. The other thing is we heard at the forum that the AFL-CIO hosted from a commissioner from the EEOC.
I was just thinking of that.
Yeah.
Feldman.
And she talked about the role that management can play in setting a tone when people do speak up and file a complaint or come forward with a concern. And that is to thank people. That in fact, employers should be grateful to folks who step forward and are willing to speak up, as opposed to fear or retaliation being the response. So I thought that was a really interesting way to think about management's role in setting a tone that helps change the culture in the workplace.
That's right.
I think she said that we should make it abhorrent that this even exists in our workplaces, right? We should just start there, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we've got another question that somebody videoed and sent in. So let's go to that one.
Hi, this is Daniela coming to you from Orlando, Florida, and I think that more women would come forward if it wasn't for fear of retaliation. Isn't that illegal? How could we make sure that no worker is punished if they do come forward?
It's a good segue. Liz, you want to lead us off on that one?
Yes, and I could not agree more with her, because absolutely, I mean, if you think about the fear that people have when they're in an environment where something isn't right and they're uncomfortable, and yet they know they are relying on their job to bring home a decent living for their family, and that if they speak up, they fear that that could risk their job. I mean, of course, you would be afraid to come forward. And number one, yes, it is illegal, correct, to retaliate against someone for coming forward. But I think, too, we should remember that you're not alone, and that often you feel alone. But particularly in a labor union, you have all of your sisters and brothers there to back you up, and to bring a collective action to the table, so that your voice is not a singular voice, but the voice of many. And so, and by the way, the National Labor Relations Act allows for that people, even if you're not in a union, to come together collectively is a protected right under the law. And so you can use that to also provide leverage in your workplace if you don't have a union voice. But I think the idea that, which was said at the very beginning, that this is about power, it's about the abuse of power, and the fact that bringing collective voices together, especially in a union, is the most effective remedy to combat that abuse of power, is really the best way, we think, to tackle it, is standing together, protecting each other, and I would say very concretely, perhaps even bringing a coworker with you. If you have a situation that you don't feel safe, don't go alone. Literally bring someone with you. And that way you have someone witnessing it who can actually back up your story and kind of be on the record with you and help make you feel safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to add to that?
The only other thing I'd say is that retaliation is real, and so people weren't wrong to fear retaliation when coming forward, and it's the reason why if I ever hear a workplace that says we never have any complaints of harassment, they may have a system that no one uses for fear of retaliation. And so this is another area where affirmatively management can communicate that in ways that can make a difference. So that they welcome complaints of harassment and discrimination, but if anyone engages in retaliation, that they take that very seriously, and that there will be consequences for that, for the retaliation by itself. That's true under the law, but employers need to make sure that it's understood that that will be true in their workplace too.
And that's where the union can actually be effective too, is in the enforcement of those policies and consequences. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Tanisha Woods, and I live in Texas. I think public sector workplaces should be safe and respectful. What's going on in the state and local government on this? What can you and I, as union members, do to ensure that they follow through with good ideas?
What a great question. And this is so great to have people's voices and have your presence as part of this process. So thanks to everyone who sent in a question. So yes, I totally agree that cities and states and public employers ought to be setting the bar high. And that makes sense because they are about the public good. And this is a public good, harassment-free workplaces. So there's obviously more that can be done, and it's uneven. I think Fatima could speak to some of this in a moment in terms of what states and cities are doing. I'll just give two examples that I've heard about recently since I've been really paying attention to this issue thanks to the cry for justice from the Me Too movement. One is the state of Minnesota, which really in the last couple months launched a pretty thorough process to review their own policies and procedures and seek input of stakeholders to figure out if they were doing enough and what they could do to increase or improve their own policies and procedures. And so they consulted our union, which I think is a great example of including every stakeholder in the process, as well as a lot of other folks. And they came up with a really thorough set of recommendations. And all of that's available online. So it's an interesting example of a state deciding to assign itself the job of assessing its own practices and recommending change. And the other I just heard about this week, I was in New York City with our AFSCME District Council 37, and I met a city council member who today actually introduced a law for the city of New York. And just to tell you a little bit about it, it's to ask each agency in the city to conduct an analysis of their own anti-harassment policies and procedures and assess whether they are at risk for sexual harassment based on some known risk factors. For example, there's a higher risk of harassment occurring in workplaces that have significant power disparities, not surprising given what you've said, but also workplaces that rely on customer service or client satisfaction, and in workplaces that are decentralized, that, you know, where there's a lot of different small workplaces, which goes to Sarita's point about folks who work in other people's homes. So those kinds of factors can increase the risk that harassment will occur, and we know that. So for those agencies to assess not only what they're doing now, but what they might need to do more of, given their potential risk. So she's introducing this piece of legislation. It has not been acted upon yet, but it's just an example of something that could be done proactively. And in that case, again, with support and a role for our union in that process. So I think it's a great model for collaboration between workers and management and, in this case, policymakers to figure out what we can do to prevent the problem before it happens and address it when it does. So I'd like to hear from you on this as well, Fatima.
Sure, and that's a really exciting initiative. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, when it had its task force and issued a report, identified a range of risk factors, and it sounds like many of them might be drawn from that good work. And so I really hope that people will take a look at that report. It's easily findable on the EEOC's website. But there are a few other things that I would say state and local governments could be doing, and a lot of state policymakers are looking at this right now. Some of it is making it easier for people to report harassment. In some places, there is layer upon layer upon layer that you have to go through before you can actually do what you just want to do, which is tell someone that something bad is happening and you want it to stop. So making it easier for people to come forward. In some state houses, and this was also true in Congress, but in some state houses, they made it nearly impossible to complain about harassment if it involved someone who was working for a member of that body. And so states have been looking at that, recognizing that actually people should be able to report. There should be some transparency around it. There should be some actual accountability for the conduct. You have to know that something is going to change. And then the prevention piece. And so it sounds like there's good work in New York on prevention, but there are a range of things that people can do, training that's actually effective rather than the sort of checked out type of stuff that happens in workplaces too often. Real engagement of people as bystanders so that people aren't going it alone. I mean, this is what unions have been about, the sister and brotherhood, so that people aren't out there by themselves, and that there are other people who could stand up either in the moment or later.
Okay, great. Well, let's go to the next video question. I know we have a few more, so I want to make sure we hear from everybody who videoed a question for us.
My name is Corey Upchurch, and I'm from Washington, D.C. I work alongside my union sisters, and I want to make sure that harassment is addressed. Besides being supportive, what can I do to help?
Right on time, Corey. So Fatima, you were just talking about bystander training. Why don't you take the first crack at this?
I'm really glad that he raised that, because I think we should step back and just remember that the role of men in this conversation is really, really critical too. I think there was some power of Me Too initially being a conversation that was solely driven by survivors. And I think too often survivors tell their stories and get shamed and discounted and silenced. So having space for people to come forward and tell their stories is really important. But we also really need men, and men are survivors too, and sometimes for them it is even harder to come forward because that narrative around what harassment has looked like for them is too little known. But even coming forward as bystanders, as allies, as supporters in this work is hugely important right now. Leading initiatives in their workplace, having visible male leadership right now saying, yes, this is an issue, a matter of equity, a matter of abuse of power, a matter of whether or not we have effective workplaces. And then lastly, you know, if it were only women examining and solving this problem, we would not get where we need to be, because a solution to this problem really is around diverse and inclusive leadership. And we need men and women to take that on as a serious, serious matter now.
I just wanted to add something quickly to that, just because I think often you're right, we run right to this being a, quote, woman's problem, right? And in the AFL-CIO, we talked about this where, as the Secretary-Treasurer, as a woman, I feel obviously very passionate about this issue, and I wanted to jump in feet first and, you know, get out there. And I said to myself, you know, wouldn't it be powerful if the male president of the AFL-CIO was the spokesperson right out of the gate, signaling that this was a priority for the labor movement and for the Federation, and it not just being, you know, the woman being the face of this all the time. And so I think that was an important step that we took for the convening we did on February 6th, is to make sure that we had the men in the room, so many of whom are our leaders, to actually talk about it being an institutional priority. So.
I just want to add one more thing, which is, Fatima said this, and just to kind of reinforce this idea that we really need men right now to speak up, to say, especially when they see harassment happening in that moment, to not be complacent and stand back and see whoever else might say something, but to actually stand up and say enough. I was on a train the other day from New York to DC, and there was this, I saw harassment in front of me and watching these young women trying to manage it. And I was in a train full of men. Everyone just pretended they weren't noticing. And at one point, you know, I stood up and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I think they've asked you now 3 times politely to leave them alone." And when I did, then other men felt like they could say something. But it's so embedded in our culture, this complacency, like, it's not my problem, that's like something going on over there, but we have to actually break that. So now more than ever, we need men, when you're witnessing and seeing it, in that moment to step up and say, enough, stop.
Even if there aren't other women in the room. I mean, maybe that's a problem if it's all male rooms, but it is also speaking up, even if there's no one to watch you and witness that. I mean, part of the cultural shift we are in right now is ensuring that those changes are showing up in every space.
That's right.
Wow, I think Sarita just gave us a great example of what bystander intervention looks like. And so, you know, this is the kind of thing that we need to do more of and to encourage more of. The other thing is, when there are males present who can say, that's not cool, we don't do that here. That's not how we are with each other. You know, to call each other out on it is going to be so powerful. So I know Corey, and I know he would do that if he had the opportunity. So thank you for the question, and thank you to the men who are willing to help us intervene and stop harassment. I think we've got at least one more videotape question.
Hello, my name is Rick Nyson from St. Cloud, Minnesota. AFSCME Local 599 and Council 5 out of Minnesota. My question is, what do we do when the accused and the accuser are both members of your local? Where do we find the balance to support both of them? Thank you.
What a great question. Liz, can you take the lead on this one?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think it is a tricky situation, but we face it quite often, and it, you know, not just with sexual harassment, but with any kind of workplace incident. You know, say there's a fight that breaks out in the workplace, or, you know, we often find ourselves in this position of, okay, there are 2 members involved, and who represents whom? But I guess the quick answer is that we do represent both members, and that every member has is entitled to a fair process and a due process, and making sure that the workplace procedures are followed. And we said off the top that the employer is actually technically responsible, right? Legally responsible. And so making sure that the employer's rules are followed, I think, is really our union role to begin with. And that dictates that, just what Sarita said earlier, you know, that we have, you know, the complaint procedures in place, we have the investigation steps outlined, we have making sure that we're really listening and taking in the information, making sure that discipline is appropriate, making sure there's no retaliation, right, and making that clear. And so the union can be a helpful voice in ensuring that those processes are followed, and that we're really advocating as I said, making sure we're taking seriously these complaints. And I know often, not often, but sometimes you might feel like, say, your steward might have a bias or something, like they're friends with so-and-so, or, you know, maybe not someone you might want to approach. Well, we have redundancies in place, but we have to make sure that that steward is trained and that they are equipped to make sure that they're being fair and objective and really hearing those complaints fairly. So I think that's something that we should be focusing on is more training, frontline training for the folks who are actually on the shop floor encountering these situations, and so that they feel equipped and confident to proceed appropriately.
Yeah. I would just add that I think that's great advice, and we're definitely moving in that direction. We have wonderful steward training in AFSCME, and we need to think about how that training, those classrooms, become a venue to support people in tackling this issue. One thing to think about as a steward, one is to talk to your staff representative and get some help on something that's that thorny. And the other is that perhaps both the complainant and the person who is harassed or alleging harassment, and the person who is the alleged harasser, might need a separate person supporting or representing them. And it would be true in the other situations that you mentioned as well. So this is a complex example of something that stewards and staff representatives have some experience in, and we should lean on those resources like training and experience to try to handle these ones as well.
I could just add one more thing about fairness, because I think sometimes people talk about notions of fairness as being ones that are applicable only to the person who has been named in a complaint. And you are going to find very few harassment survivors who will use a system they perceive to be unfair. So having a system that is clear, that is transparent, that has built in some of the things that you are talking about, including the fact that you won't be retaliated against, that's all a part of building a process that is fair. And so I'm really glad that they raised the question in the way they did, because it's really critical idea that has to be embedded in our system for the good of the system, but for the good of anyone who would participate in it. Because if people do not have faith that this will be a fair process, they will see it as a process that they should not use.
Right.
Yeah. Just wanted to expand on that quickly. We do have language in our collective bargaining agreements, and sometimes that language is outdated, and that's one of the findings that's coming out of the February 6th convening that we'll be putting in the report, is that people should be refreshing their language. And that transparency piece, I mean, there are additional things you can negotiate in those agreements to modernize the language, instead of just using the EEOC PAT language from the 90s, right? Sometimes we haven't kept up with how those have been modernized, and to refresh those.
But it's a good reminder of the incredibly important role that unions play in this moment. Here we have organizations that exist, are organizations to create fairness in the workplace and due process, and to make sure that people are treated respectfully. So it's a great time to lean into things like the collective bargaining agreement and steward training and other processes that we have in place. So I think we have one question that came in through an email, I think, and I'm just going to read it out because it's not going to be on the screen. What is your opinion about forming a special committee within the union to mediate incidents of harassment? So I'll say a couple of words, and then if anybody else has some thoughts, that'd be great. So I think that it really depends on your workplace and what kind of experience you have with management using labor management committees or other kinds of informal or labor management processes. So if that is working for you, you might consider setting up some kind of a mediation committee. But it's really important to make sure that the person who is bringing forward a harassment complaint is using that kind of process voluntarily. And so you've got to have a way for people to choose something like that versus a formal complaint, and that people are making really informed choices about what kind of process to use. So that is just a little bit on that issue. I would also say that we have a sister union up in Canada, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, that has given some advice to folks about very frontline sort of mediation that might occur where somebody just wants to be clear that behavior is unwanted, sort of like what Sarita witnessed on the train, where they're not interested in filing a complaint. They just want it to stop. And so there might be a mediation role for a steward or a leader of the union to say, would you like me to help you communicate that message? That's a very informal mediation process. And again, it would only make sense if the person who's bringing forward the harassment complaint chooses that or wishes not to file a formal complaint. Looks like you have some thoughts on this too, Fatima.
Well, just a couple of thoughts, because I think having informal mechanisms are important, especially for the range of conduct that doesn't yet rise to the level of a hostile environment. You know, having a range of ways for people to engage with their supervisors, engage with the union, and resolve things quickly, it can be a good, right? I think on mediation, especially around this issue, it's the voluntary piece is really key. But you also have to be really careful here that there isn't unspoken pressure to mediate for the good of the union, right? Or unspoken pressure to participate in systems with people who are not equally balanced with you in terms of the power dynamic, either in your actual organization or just in the union. And so this is a thorny issue. And whatever it is, I think it really has to be driven by the survivor. And so for many people, they want a range of restorative justice type of mechanisms, but we have to be really careful that that doesn't become a term or a code for actually dismissing behavior that there's an organizational-wide responsibility to address.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Anyone else? And I believe we have one more videotaped question.
My name's Monica De Leon from AFSCME 3299 in California. Many times, service workers, like women who clean offices overnight or who work inside homes alone with their client, are subject to harassment. How can we stand up against harassment in non-traditional workplaces where the harasser can be a member of the public or a client?
Sarita, you brought this forward in your opening statement, so would you like to speak to this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we have to make sure that all women have the ability to pursue justice safely, right? Like they feel safe and able to address harassment at any workplace, whether it's in people's homes or it's in restaurants or it's in traditional workplace settings, wherever it is. And if we start from that premise, and the stories I know I've been hearing of different women who are coming forward with their stories now, what comes to mind for me are a few things. One is the importance of connection right now. Like, people want to connect across our different neighborhoods, our communities, our workplaces. Like, as leaders in your union, you know, when I think about all these great questions coming forward, when I think about stewards, how cool would it be for you to be connecting actually with the incredible organizing that is actually happening in non-union workplaces in some sectors, whether it's farm worker women, whether it's domestic workers, it's restaurant workers, to really seek out those relationships and conversations about what is being done. And frankly, to Liz's point earlier, there's such incredible assets that the labor movement has, and systems and processes in place that can be shared and co-trained to non-union workers, because many of the workers that you're talking about are unfortunately not in unions. So how can we think creatively about connection right now at the community level? I think a second thing is talking about this. Like, we should not let this moment pass. And so talking about it means, like, not just talking about it in your workplace, but how about we talk to our daughters? How about we talk to our mothers? How about we talk to our grandmothers and our neighbors and our sisters and our cousins, but actually have conversations with one another about experiences that we've had with harassment in the workplace or sexual violence or assault, and build community and camaraderie in that way, but also to help create platforms where people can share their stories. You know, in January, during the State of the Union, there was another event planned by a number of us called the State of Our Union, which was an opportunity for the Me Too movement to organize a broad set of women to come forward and share their stories. And what was so powerful in that moment was almost all the women were working women who had incredible stories to tell, and they could hear each other. They can understand their commonalities and also envision a future together. So how can we in communities, from the places that we sit at, how can we create platforms like that where women from different workplaces could come together and share their stories, both to heal, but also to find pathways forward, to share resources and tools. And then finally, to the public campaigning part, there's a lot of great campaigning happening around harassment right now. I mean, when I think about the coming together of domestic workers, farm workers, and women in the entertainment industry, that is pretty powerful. So how can we support those kinds of public campaigns from our perches? And I would say there's the entertainment industry campaigns, but there's also campaigns in our communities. We do a lot of work with the Restaurant Opportunities Center United, restaurant workers who've been fighting on, and trying to progress policies that are meant to, you know, really address deep inequities. So the One Fair Wage campaign that's happening across the country is about the elimination of the tipped wage. And, you know, if you think about it, restaurant servers, workers, bartenders, they get a tipped wage of like $2.13, and then they have to make up the rest in tips, which means they often have to endure harassment. So there's opportunities and policy campaigns like that where employers are being called out to change their culture and their policies, and we can be standing in solidarity like we do so well as a union movement, but let's be expansive about who we're standing in solidarity with. Not only our brothers and sisters in our workplaces, but how about our brothers and sisters in the broader community right now in other sectors of the economy?
All those potential union members,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
And actually, some of this is about making policy change, which you've talked about, Fatima, but I think the state of California does something to protect workers who work in people's homes.
Right.
Do you want to speak to that?
I mean, one of the things that this moment is highlighting is how many people actually don't have the protections they need under the law. And so addressing the fact that for each workplace, no matter how small, even if it's a workplace of one, no one deserves to endure discrimination and harassment. Full stop. So there's a thing you can do about that, and states, some of them are moving forward to meet where California already is. Or as we think about how contingent work is generally, and that's a direction that more and more of the workplace is going, no matter who your boss is, if you're in a work-like relationship with someone, if you're working on contract, you still don't deserve to experience harassment.
That's
right? So it should follow contract protections. And dealing with things like one fair wage, there is no reason that harassment and this ugly history of harassment should be so embedded in how people earn their living, right? But you have a system set up with the tip wage where that is exactly what happens. So there are a range of things that you can do. Plus, turning up the volume on our harassment laws, which haven't been updated in a very long time, is a really, really important thing to do right now, not only on prevention, but also making sure that people don't lose for technical reasons, or making sure that people can actually get real relief, real remedies when they experience harassment. So right now, a number of states are moving forward. We need to make sure that these policy campaigns match the really exciting public campaigns that are about all workers, but that have really excitingly centered the experiences of workers who are too often invisible in our public debate.
That's right. That's right.
Can I mention too the example of how the union can be central in this and really be a driver in building community connections and coalitions is the ordinance in Seattle and in Chicago with hotel and restaurant workers union Unite Here around instituting panic buttons for room attendants who are working in hotels, who are often some of the most harassed in their work because they show up to the room to refill shampoo bottles or do the bedding, and often are encountering guests who are acting inappropriately and often in some cases subject to assaulting a room attendant. So the union played a central role in actually passing an ordinance at the city level to make that required safety equipment for women and men in that profession. And I find that such a wonderful example of how you can bring together union activists and something that's a very big problem on the job, and then tying that to a policy action and a public campaign.
That's right.
I think it's a really great example.
It's a terrific example.
This is one of those let's not waste a good crisis moments, right? We got so many things that we can change to improve this for people's day-to-day work experiences as well as their life experiences. So why don't we take a few minutes just to hear some thoughts as we come in to the close of the hour about what we ought to be doing next in this work. So if you were to think about one thing that is most needed to create harassment-free workplaces and that you in your role and your organization could help drive, what's the one thing you want to aspire to next in terms of creating these safe and respectful and inclusive workplaces that we've talked about? And why don't we start with Sarita this time?
Sure. It's such a great question. I wish I could there's one, but I'll try to be quick. So one is, let's believe women. How about that? Culturally, if we can move, and that's the beauty of the Me Too movement, that it's forcing us to really believe women when they say, I am experiencing harassment. I think is huge. And so, which leads me to, I think we're in a moment when we have to understand the relationship of culture change work to policy work and practices and norms. There's such a beautiful way in which the culture that Me Too movement has created is actually opening up space for the conversations about how can we be better as unionists in addressing these issues? What's the role of management in addressing these issues? What are the state policies that we need? And vice versa, policies can also help to create new and different cultures. So really understanding that is something we've been doing and trying to figure out how we have these things fuel each other so we could advance a better future. Which brings me to my last point, which is what motivates all of us now and into action is really hope. And there's a way in which the conversation about harassment and violence and sexual assault can often feel very heavy in a way that makes people want to sort of walk away from it. But how do we in this moment actually be aspirational about the future that we do want to have? What does a completely harassment-free workplace look like? Where do we want it to be in the year 2048? And what can we do to get there? So how do we create spaces for all of us to share our own visions of what that could look like? Feels really important in this moment to give us sort of the energy that we need to really build the relationships, build the campaigns, and move the kind of work we need to ensure we have a harassment-free workplaces in the future.
Fatima.
I am so terrible about choosing just one thing, so I'm just going to tell you. So I'm just going to go with two. The first is harassment is a symptom of a broader problem.
Yeah.
It's a symptom of a broader problem around gender inequality and around power. And so if we are going to do one thing, it's probably to disrupt that, right? It is to see harassment not in isolation of job conditions that don't meet the needs of workers, of discrimination that crosses many other sectors, of wages that are low, of schedules that are unfair. Harassment is very much a part of all of those things. So I actually think the solution is rethinking what it means to work with dignity and having it be that conversation. But a second shorter term piece that I just have to name around the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is that I'm still in awe that we have 1,600 people who have come to us, and we have hundreds of new lawyers. There's no way for us to meet that full need unless we continue to get more attorneys volunteering their time, giving us their support and being a part of this network, and we continue to get more supporters of this fund.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Liz.
Well, I guess the best part about going third is that all the good things have been said, and I would say what she said and what she said. I would echo that. But what I would add is leadership, and this was touched on earlier, is the signaling that takes place. When the leadership of an organization says, you know, this is a priority, we're taking this seriously, it has to end, and we aspire to a workplace free of harassment and discrimination. Boom. So once we get there, I think giving more women opportunities to be in those leadership positions, and since this is a situation that mostly affects women, to empower women to actually ascend into elected office, union office, because we have 6.5 million women in the labor movement. Not very many people realize it. I always say we're the largest women's organization in the country. And to get more of those women in positions of power. And I think that could really make a big difference.
Well, I'll just say for AFSCME's part, I think we can help hold public employers, cities, counties, states, federal agencies to the highest standard on stopping harassment, preventing harassment, creating inclusive and safe and respectful workplaces. And we as a union of public service workers can hold management accountable to that and really be part of making public workplaces the gold standard in terms of the kind of respect and dignity that has been described here. So I think we're coming into a close, and I would just want to start by thanking these wonderful sisters who have joined us today. It's great to really grapple with this issue and try to provide some support for the many AFSCME activists and leaders and stewards who I know are also grappling with it. And I want to say once again that at a moment where our basic freedom to negotiate for fairness in the workplace has been under attack, it's great to remember why it matters.
That's
and
right.
we organized and we fought for collective bargaining in the workplace and for a voice on the job for a reason, which is to address these kinds of issues. And finally, I'll just say that we do have some resources available, thanks to the women here as well as other organizations. And you can visit our website, afscme.org/prevention resources for more information. And it includes the checklists and advice from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that Fatima mentioned, and as also other things that you might find useful in terms of collective bargaining language. And we'll put the video from this panel up on that website as well. So if you'd like sisters and brothers in your local to see this, they'll be able to have access to it too. So with that, I think that we're going to close the hour, and thank you again for being with us, and thank you to all the folks who sent in questions, and especially to the activists and stewards and leaders who spent this hour with us and are fighting for fairness in your workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you.